And you're watching Book TV on C-SPAN 2. This is our live coverage of the 16th Annual Texas Book Festival. On your screen there, the state capitol in Austin, Texas, and the book fair is taking place in and around the state capitol. The C-SPAN bus is also here. We're about 2 blocks down Congress Avenue from the state capitol, and the Book TV tent has several different events coming up live this afternoon, and we've got panels coming up on India, Pakistan, and also on freshwater. And then Dana Priest at about 5:15 Eastern Time this afternoon will be speaking in the Book TV tent. But right now there's a panel just beginning on American debt, and it's a standing room only crowd, as you'll be able to see here in just a minute. H.W. Brands has a book called Greenback Planet. David Graeber, Debt, the First 5,000 Years, are the panelists. After this panel is over, we'll take your calls. We want to hear from you on American debt. But right now, here's the panel on American debt.
It's fabulous to see so many people out here today. It's fabulous to see such a large crowd out here today. I'm wondering, does this have anything to do with the fact that the debt and the dollar might actually be relevant topics today? We're really lucky to have 2 fabulous, prolific writers with us today. And what 2 topics could be more relevant than to talk about today's climate of economic crisis? David Graeber and W.H. Brands, and here to talk about their new books. I'm assuming we won't have any trouble getting questions from the audience, but let me do a couple of housekeeping things first. Because I'm hoping that when you're all done over here and you're impressed with the 2 authors, you're going to go back in that tent right next to here and buy their books in the book signing tent. 15 minutes after the end of the session, or actually it's so close it might be 15 seconds, the authors will sign their books at the book signing tent. One thing about the festival, and I don't know about you guys, but this is my favorite festival. You know, I love South by Southwest. I like ACL, the Austin Film Festival. I've never seen anything like this. This festival is fabulous. The people that put this on are doing the Lord's work, depending on which Lord you're thinking about. But along with celebrating books and authors, the festival benefits the Texas public libraries and literacy across the state, and boy, do we need that. Proceeds from the sales of all books and merchandise in the sales tent benefit these efforts. We are celebrating our 16th anniversary this year, and in the past 15 years, the festival has contributed more than $2.5 million to libraries and reached more than 35,000 children in low-income schools throughout the state. So I want each and every one of you to buy the books from both these guys, because you're going to be able to read great books and also benefit this wonderful mission. I am not an expert in the debt and the dollar. My name is Paul Stekler. I know a little bit about politics, and I found both these books fabulous. First, 2 quick introductions. I loved it when I began surfing the web trying to figure out who David was. And in the background on David Graeber, the author of Debt, the First 5,000 Years, and of course the sequel will be the next 5,000 years. The very first description I found in Wikipedia stated that he's an American anthropologist and an anarchist. I'm not sure how anarchists actually get together to actually sit down and write those books, but I like the idea. He currently holds the position of reader in social anthropology in Goldsmiths, the University of London. He has previously taught at Yale. He's the author of a number of books, essays, and articles for Harper's, The Nation, The New Left Review. It is his dissertation work, which we were talking about over in the author's tent, focusing on the legacy of slavery in the endlessly fascinating island of Madagascar, which is also partially dealt with in this book. In 2006, he delivered the Melanowski Memorial Lecture at the London School of Economics, an annual talk that honors outstanding anthropologists who have fundamentally shaped the study of our culture. And we're glad to have him here today.
Oh, thanks so much.
Secondly, on this panel, we have our own W.H. Bill Brands, who teaches at University of Texas, and as far as I can tell, since he's written, is it 24 books? This is the only time he's actually out. He's just writing books most of the time. He's the Dixon Allen Anderson Centennial Professor of History at the University of Texas. Before that, he taught at Vanderbilt and Texas A&M. He's a two-time finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for Traitor to His Class, The Privileged Life and Radical Presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 2008, and The First American, The Life and Times of Benjamin Franklin, 2000. Like I said, 24 books. He's presented, I believe, 8 times here. He's a past Texas Award winner at this festival, and he has not one but 2 books at the festival this year. So if you can't get enough of him now, come back tomorrow. And that book is The Murder of Jim Fisk for the Love of Jane Mansfield, along with the book we're discussing today, Greenback Planet, How the Dollar Conquered the World and Threatened Civilization as We Know It. It actually sounds like a horror movie, and maybe it is. So what I'd like to start off with today is to have each of our authors talk about their books for a few minutes, then I'm going to ask a few softball questions. I'm going to leave the hardball questions to you guys, and I'll give you a prompt, and we're going to begin to have people queue up to ask those questions, and we'll keep those questions going on for as long as we possibly can before you go out and buy their books. So firstly, David, can you tell me about debt?
Okay.
Why?
Why? Why debt? Why do we have debt? Well, you know, one of the questions first questions I asked when writing the book is, what is debt? Because one of the things I was trying to explain was the strange moral power that debt has over us. It all started, actually, with a conversation I had with someone I'd met at a party about Madagascar. I was talking about the third world debt crisis and how I'd been involved in these drop the debt campaigns as an activist around the year 2000. I'm talking about the effects of structural adjustment policies inflicted by the IMF. Gave you some examples that in Madagascar they were forced to cut the budget radically to repay Citibank and other banks at approved interest rates, and as a result they had to get rid of their malaria eradication program, which had kept mosquitoes away from the highlands. As a result, there was an epidemic in which 10,000 people died. And you know, her reaction was, well, that's terrible, but you know, but they borrowed the money. I mean, surely you're not saying they shouldn't pay the debt at all. And I thought about it and said, well, you know, this was a rather liberal lawyer, activist lawyer actually, who I was talking to. What other thing would cause someone to say, well, you know, it's really sad about all those dead babies, but, you know, of course you have to pay the debts. I mean, come on, default. And, you know, what other circumstance would someone like that actually approve of the death of 5,000 babies? Something about debt has this absolute moral hold over us, and that's really what I was trying to address. Where does that come from? A debt, I mean, what a debt is, if you want to know what it's a promise, but it's a certain type of promise. And the way I like to put it, it's a promise that has been corrupted in a certain sense by mathematics, and ultimately by violence, because you can only really turn a promise, which is a deeply personal thing, into an impersonal form like a debt, into math, something that can be exactly quantified, when there's an element of coercion. From there, and that which also makes it transferable, because normally if I make a promise to you, you can't give that promise to someone else. In a way, if you want to understand the origins of money, it's how promises become mathematical. And the history of that is what the book is really about.
Good answer. Mm-hmm. Let's move from debt for a second to dollars. Greenbacks.
Yes, I wrote about the dollar. The short answer is that I was asked to write the book, but the answer as to why I said yes is that I have been talking about the dollar in the, well, now 30 years that I've been teaching American history. It's something that's very easy to take for granted. You can pull a dollar bill out of your pocket and you can take it to the store and you can spend it. But if you think about it for a minute, there's a certain kind of magic involved in that, because the piece of paper that you pull out of your pocket is not worth $1. It might be intrinsically worth a nickel or something like that. It works even better if you happen to walk around with $100 bills in your pocket, because then $5 becomes worth $100. And I regularly ask my students, why is this so? You know, what is it that makes this piece of paper worth, I don't know, 5 hours of someone's time or 5 large pizzas or something like that? And we get into the legal background of it. And I do a magic trick where I don't very often get to do magic tricks. But I do a magic trick. In fact, let's see, maybe I can do it now. Yeah, here it is. Okay. I've got this piece of paper. Not very many of you can see it, but it's a $5 bill. And if I take it into the CVS down the way or any store, I can exchange this for $5 of really solid stuff, $5 of food or $5 of medicine or whatever it might be. But this piece of paper, this paper's paper isn't worth intrinsically $5, but there is something on the piece of paper that affects this kind of magic that makes it worth $5. And probably those of you in the back row won't be able to, well, certainly can't see, you won't be able to answer this very well, but for anybody, there is a magic formula that is printed on this piece of paper that makes it worth $5. It takes a piece of paper that's intrinsically worth a nickel and transforms it into something that is worth $5. Do any of you know what that magic formula is? Show of hands, anybody? No? Somebody, well, somebody's waving money back there. Yes. Well, U.S. Treasury is a good start, but that's not the magic formula. In the way back, legal tender, there it is, okay? In fine print on the front, it says, this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private, which means if you're offering something for sale and you put a $5 price tag on it, and I walk in with one of these, you have to take it. And that's the magic. But why does it work? I mean, Congress can say, and that's where the formula comes from, Congress passed the first legal tender act in the middle of the Civil War. Until then, dollars in American history were coin money. They were gold or silver. There were private notes that were circulating that represented themselves as money, but they weren't legal tender. You didn't have to take those notes any more than you have to take a check. Now, I started writing this book because it had historical interest, but as I was writing it, even since it's come out, it has developed greater contemporary interest. One of the things that I say at the end of the book is that the dollar is almost certainly going to lose its privileged standing as the world's reserve currency. And foreign creditors to the United States are going to do their best to diversify their currency portfolios. Well, what do you know? Just in the paper a couple of days ago, Reuters had a report that China has agreed with the nations of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, that trading in that bloc will be done in Chinese yuan rather than in dollars. And then I read something just yesterday, or I saw a piece on TV, which flew in the face of my magic trick. It seems that the legislature of Louisiana, any of you heard of this? Just happened the last couple of days. The legislature of Louisiana passed a law that said that people who sell second-hand goods cannot accept cash for those goods. And they cannot. Now, in the first place, this strikes me as it's probably in violation of federal law, because if it's legal tender, it's legal tender. But secondly, it raises some really interesting questions about the direction of the dollar. If cash isn't good anymore, then what in the world are we going to go to? So that's a long-winded way of saying that's why I wrote the book.
Remember, that is Louisiana you're talking about. Let me throw a question out to both of you to start out with, and I want to throw some specific questions about the books. We are in the middle of what everybody seems to agree is an economic crisis around the world, and part of that crisis is the place of the dollar. Okay, assuming that Chinese currency or the euro, especially the euro, is in any better shape. The yen obviously hasn't done very well in the 20 years since the Japanese collapse. At the same time, we've just had this incredible crisis over the debt crisis, which, David, I think you would say is maybe not what everybody thought it was. So where exactly, considering where you guys are coming from a history of debt and a history of the greenbacks, what are we liable to be getting into in the 21st century? I mean, is there a replacement for a dollar? You know, is this debt crisis going to blow up in our entire economic system? You go first? Go ahead.
Okay. Well, it's hard to know where to start on that one.
A large question,
yeah.
I realize.
I was just going to tag something onto what you said. Actually, I think the actual amount of dollars worth is 3 cents, because that's how much the Federal Reserve pays the mint to make them, no matter what the denomination. Well, the system of money we have now, one thing it's important to remember is that it took a long time for the U.S., it's one of the last large nations in the world, to kind of come over to the central bank model. I mean, there was a big fight over it early on, they got rid of it. But the basic model for how modern money works is in a lot of ways almost the opposite of the way that people talk about it in mainstream political discourse. I always like to give the example of the origins of the Bank of England. In 1694, a group of London merchants made a loan to the King of England, William II, to fight a war in France. It's always a war. And he gave them the right to take the 1.2 million pounds that he now owed them and to lend it to other people in the form of banknotes. That's what British pound sterling banknotes actually are. And in fact, I don't actually have any in my pocket anymore, but if you look at a 10-pound note, it has a picture of the Queen, and it says, "I promise to pay the bearer the sum of 10 pounds. It's not actually 10 pounds, it's a promise to pay 10 pounds in, at that time, silver, worth of silver or gold, and now worth of something. And, you know, the way that's mainly affected is you can pay your taxes with it, so it cancels the debt with a credit. But it is circulating government debt. And in a way, that's what money has continued to be, modern money. The Federal Reserve works with a lot more smoke and mirrors than the Bank of England, but ultimately it's the same principle. They make up money with a magic wand, they lend it to the government, and they circulate the debt. So that money, you know, effectively now is circulating government debt. As a result, if the government got rid of the debt entirely. I mean, there was a study now came out under the Clinton administration when they were trying to get rid of the deficit, or they went into a budget surplus. What would happen if they got rid of the debt entirely? And they concluded that it would cause an economic catastrophe. Because banks would have to make up all the money, which, you know, in certain periods of American history they did do. But you know, when Andrew Jackson got rid of the debt, the results were not exactly salutary. It was the one time anybody ever has. So in a way, the wheels are turning in the opposite direction as we think they are. Money isn't actually this scarce resource like petroleum or something, which there's only so much of. The question is how much we create and who gets it. And that's that's the real political struggle. Now, then when you go on a global scale, you know, it's very similar. For most of Cold War history, the countries that actually were holding the treasury bonds, you know, the U.S. has this amazing advantage that it can effectively write checks that are then treated like they were gold and are used as reserve currency by the rest of the world, and nobody ever cashes for that reason. They just roll them over. It used to be West Germany was one of the bigger holders, the Gulf states, Japan, South Korea. You know, what do they all have in common? They're all under U.S. military protection in one way or another, have U.S. military bases. And in a way, the amount of the debt, exterior debt, is almost exactly the same as, or at least it increases along with military spending. So these people are lending us the money to create these armies that sit on top of them and never quite pay it back. Now that China's got involved, it's a little more complicated. But that's the system that's being challenged. And it is simply true that, you know, for the last few hundred years, the global reserve currency has tended to be that of the premier world military power. I don't think that's a coincidence. How exactly it works, we could all talk about. So it strikes me that, you know, that's what's being contested here with the primacy of the dollar. And it's not only what other currency would replace the dollar, but who would possibly replace the U.S.'s military hegemon.
The question of the future of the dollar is very closely related to the future of the American economy, and as David just suggested, the country that has the biggest, most powerful economy is usually one that dictates the terms of world finance. You can see this in the case of the United States. The United States was the most productive economic power in the world by the beginning of the 20th century. At that point, it remained an international debtor, but during the First World War, and as David said, it's always wars that bring this about. During the First World War, as the belligerents borrowed very heavily in the United States tipped from being a debtor nation to the world's largest creditor. And the era of America's creditorship, when it was a creditor to the world, lasted from the 1910s to the 1980s. And it was during that period that the dollar and American diplomats wrote the rules of the international financial system, specifically the Bretton Woods system that originated at the end of the Second World War. At that time, America's industrial production, America's industrial GDP was roughly equal to that of the rest of the world combined. And with that kind of leverage, the United States was in a position to dictate to the rest of the world. The world financial system, other currencies were linked to the dollar, and the dollar was pegged to gold. And that gold peg was considered quite important because something like a gold standard has always been a check on governments from producing more and more of the notes. If you have legal tender, and as I said, for the first time in the United States, this came into effect in the 1860s, and it occasioned great controversy because until then governments could not be trusted not to just run the printing press and run the printing press until the dollar, the currency, became worthless. That's what happened to the Confederate currency during the Civil War. The Union government was more circumspect, and it won the war, and so it was able to redeem those legal tender dollars. But gold still remained the model of a currency. Gold because governments can't produce it, only God can produce gold. And gold remained the linchpin of world currencies from 1945, the end of the Second World War, until the 1970s. But by then the United States had slipped from, it was still the #1 power in the world economically, but it no longer had the advantage over the rest of the world that it had. This was inevitable. This wasn't a result of any particular policy decisions by the United States or by its leaders, although those contributed. It's true that Lyndon Johnson's attempt simultaneously to fight the war in Vietnam and to fund the Great Society put great strain on the U.S. budget. But the larger issue was that since 1945, from 1945 until the mid-1960s, the rest of the world began to recover from World War II. The United States was, in a very basic way, the only winner of World War II. And the United States stood atop the pinnacle of economic power. The American economy continued to grow after 1945, and so you can say that the top of the mountain got taller, but the slopes of the mountain got taller faster. So by the early 1970s, America probably had something on the order of 1/3 of world GDP, and it would continue to decline. And it's down to around 1/4 to 1/5 of world GDP now. So under these circumstances, it's quite unrealistic to expect that the dollar will continue to have the sway that it had 60 years ago. Now, this doesn't mean that the United States will be knocked from its perch immediately and entirely. There is no single currency that is a viable alternative to the dollar, at least not at the moment. Much more likely will be some sort of market basket of currencies, or the individual sovereign debt, sovereign wealth funds and people who have large foreign currency holdings will simply diversify. Instead of holding all dollars, they hold dollars and euros and yuan. So it's more or less inevitable, if you ask me. There are 300 million people in the United States. There are 7 billion people in the world. And so, under those circumstances, things are going to even out a bit more from what they were 60 years ago.
One of the wonderful things about both these books, besides the fact that both these gentlemen are teachers who can really write, which is not something you always see in scholars. These are really, really great books to read. Is that these books are also more than just an op-ed piece about debt and the dollar today. They're histories, and really, really interesting histories about things that most of us don't know much about. So I'm going to put David on the spot over here. One of the most interesting things that you wrote about was talking about debt and virtual money in the context of the slave trade within Africa.
Yeah.
It was an amazing chapter. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's one of the fascinating things to me. I discovered all sorts of crazy things when I was researching this book, ranging from debt cancellation in Mesopotamia to the fact that the sort of free market populism actually comes out of Sharia in medieval Persia. But one of the things that really struck me was about the slave trade, because when I was involved in these Drop the Debt campaigns, one of the whole arguments was, Africa is the most indebted continent in the world, and they made the argument, well, who owes what to who here? We don't owe you, you owe us, look what you did to us, which is, a fair case. But you can make that case even stronger if you look at how the slave trade was actually conducted, because it was entirely carried out through the manipulation of debt. The stage where people were coming in and just militarily taking people away, that did happen. But it was often an initial stage, and it was followed up by creating these really elaborate debt traps, so that the whole thing was a very, very complex credit scheme where merchants in England would forward funds to merchants working overseas, would forward funds to African merchants, and everybody would be advancing something to someone else till it got to the local level where, for example, one common pattern was to foment wars between people who wouldn't be having them otherwise because indebted kings had to figure out some way to pay back their creditors. But an even more common one was simply to advance goods and get people caught in credit traps. Another way was to corrupt the legal system so that any crime, you'd have to pay an enormous penalty, and if you can't pay the penalty, then you get sent away. So there are all sorts of different techniques, but it was, there's this gigantic network of debt traps. And why I find it interesting, it's intrinsically important in itself, but one reason is because it provides a model of what must have happened in human history in a lot of other places. This is a sort of very rapid, traumatic, catastrophic version of what I call human economies are converted into commercial economies, because you do have these very complex systems of debt that exist in traditional societies. But if you look at money as an anthropologist, you look around the world, the most common use of money in places where you don't have states is not to exchange goods and services, which are usually, there's complex gift systems where you actually dispose of your cows and your acquire tools, ordinary things that we buy and sell. They don't. But they do have money, and they use it to rearrange social relations with one another. They, if people have to settle fines, if there's quarrels, if there's a marriage needs to be negotiated. So social relations are actually carried out through money, and what we would consider economic relations aren't. And what happened is that, this sets up a way that the whole system can be corrupted. So people show up. The way I usually put it is like, imagine what would happen to our society if a bunch of space aliens suddenly showed up with, incredibly powerful weaponry, no morality whatsoever, and said, okay, well, we'll give $1 million to anybody who provides us human workers. We're not going to really say what happens to them. Just go ahead. Somebody's going to take the bait, and all it takes is a few. But what they ended up doing was converting what had been monetary systems used to rearrange relationships between people into ways of extracting people. And I think that if you want to look at how money originated in the form that we have, it was exactly a process like that probably happened 5,000 years ago in places like Mesopotamia, of which the records are now lost.
Bill, there are a number of different important figures in American history that appear in your book. Two of them are figures that are very important to me back when I was a young political scientist doing analysis on the populist party's rise and fall. In the Midwest, the most important figure was William Jennings Bryan and his Cross of Gold speech, which, by the way, you can hear recordings of, recorded years later. This is one of the great speeches of American politics. It's a big part of William Sapphire's book on speeches, and great speeches were delivered in a very different way back then because he sounds kind of squeaky. So you've got William Jennings Bryan, the Cross of Gold, and then my own political hero when I was a kid, Richard Nixon. No lie, don't tell anybody. So tell us how Bryan and Nixon affected the dollar in their own times.
Richard Nixon would roll over in his grave to be compared to William Jennings Bryan. But in a very fundamental way, they were aiming for the same thing. William Jennings Bryan became the spokesman of the populist movement in the 1890s. And at the heart of the populist movement was a belief that the financial system of the United States was tilted against farmers specifically, ordinary people generally, but farmers specifically. And they had a very specific complaint, namely falling prices for farm products. The price of corn went down by half between the 1870s and the 1890s. Wheat was comparable. Cotton was a little bit more than this. This was a very serious problem for farmers because farmers typically operate under conditions of debt. And debtors are very seriously disadvantaged when prices fall. If you borrow $100 when wheat is $1 a bushel, you have to grow 100 bushels of wheat to pay it back. But if the price falls to 50 cents, you have to grow 200 bushels of wheat to pay it back. And so the fundamental goal or the trick behind managing a money supply is to get the money supply to grow at the same rate as the economy as a whole. And if you do, then prices overall will remain stable. The fall in prices was, in certain respects, a consequence of the success of the American economy. That is, the economy was growing faster than the money supply. And so prices were falling. Farmers were disadvantaged by this. And farmers, their spokesman, William Jennings Bryan, claimed that the way to alleviate their distress was to expand the money supply. And this made perfectly good economic and financial sense. But it seemed to those people who were creditors that it was a kind of theft, because to devalue the dollar meant that their debt, what they were owed, was worth less than it had been the day before. The preferred method of devaluation for the populace was the remonetization of silver, and their campaign slogan was "Free Silver." What Bryan and the populace wanted to do was to sever the connection between the American money system and gold. The problem, as they saw it, and they were right, was that there wasn't enough gold to go around. If we could expand the money supply by adding silver, which constitutionally was part of the American money supply from the very beginning, but it had fallen out of circulation in the last 20 years, then the debt burden of farmers would be diminished and prosperity would return to the heartland. This was the goal. And this became the crucial issue of the campaign of 1896, in which American voters had to make a decision. And the vote came down to a crucial decision by a new class of people. Farmers were going to vote for Bryan and the Democrats and free silver. And the owners of the big corporations were going to oppose Bryan and free silver. They would vote for William McKinley and the preservation of the gold standard. The wild card in this particular campaign was the new industrial working class. Would the industrial workers who worked for the capitalists but who shared a standard of living with the farmers, which way would they go? All sorts of devices and shenanigans were employed to get the urban workers to side with the farmers or with the capitalists. When it came right down to it, they made a decision in favor of their bosses rather than their working class comrades. And with this, free silver, the idea of adding silver to the currency, went out the window. America tightened its grip on the gold standard. And it lasted, with a brief break in the 1930s during the Depression, until 1971, when Richard Nixon did what William Jennings Bryan had advocated by cutting the United States off from the international gold standard. Nixon would be greatly chagrined to be compared with Bryan, but there it is.
Okay. I have a question about that, actually. So is it really true that The Wizard of Oz is actually about that? Because one interpretation of the book, it's all about the yellow brick road, right? Going to the Emerald City of Oz, which stands for ounce. Emerald City being green. But also the story that they always say is that the Dorothy is the farmer who's blown away from her farm. Or sometimes she's Theodore Roosevelt, because Dorothy and Theodore are backward, same thing backwards. The Scarecrow is the farmer who has no brain and therefore gets foreclosed on. The Tin Woodsman is the industrial proletariat who has no heart and won't act in solidarity with them. And the Cowardly Lion is the political class who won't do anything about it.
So does that mean that does that mean the wizard is actually Mark Hanna running the campaign of William McKinley as he sat on his front porch the entire time?
Yeah, there's a lot of interpretations.
This is the interpretation. And the interpretation arose almost at the same time as The Wizard of Oz came out. The author, Frank Baum, never acknowledged that this was what he was doing. And I don't know if he decided, okay, I didn't actually do it, but if people want to read into it what they will, maybe so. Maybe he just thought it was better if he never did. And maybe it may simply have been people reading into it what they wanted to read into it. I suspect that it was something in between, in that there was certain imagery that would have come naturally to anyone of populist leanings during that particular period. And so the fact that Dorothy is Theodore backwards, that seems a bit of a stretch. Given, and because you would really have to turn Theodore Roosevelt quite on his head to get him to be anything like Dorothy. But it's an interesting story. Historians have been dining out on it ever since, and Frank Baum is long since dead, so he can't deny it.
Yeah.
I want to ask one more question, and then we're going to start taking questions from the audience, and you can queue up over here as much room as we have. One of the interesting things about David's book is the whole idea of debt and morality. I was really taken with the idea that somebody who's an anthropologist is writing a history, worldwide history of debt. When we think of debt, debt is a bad thing. That was used very effectively politically in the last debt crisis, or made-up debt crisis in the summertime. The whole idea of comparing household debt to American debt, which there may be some problems with, they're not exactly the same thing. The concept of debtor's prison, which Bill and David and I were talking about in the origin of debtor's prison. So talk to me a little bit about, very briefly so we can have more questions over here, about the whole idea of debt and morality and perhaps the political uses of that.
Okay, yeah. One thing I found which is quite fascinating when I was researching the relation of ideas of debt in the great world religions is that words for debt and sin in many of the ancient languages are actually the same. That's true in Sanskrit, debt, guilt, and sin, same word. It's not true in Hebrew, but it becomes true in Aramaic. So in the Lord's Prayer, where it says, forgive us our trespasses, that's actually the Anglican translation. The earlier translation was forgive us our debts, which is actually what it says in the Aramaic. It says, forgive us our debts just as we forgive those who owe us money. Of course, the idea is, well, we don't actually forgive those who owe us money, do we? Do we really deserve to be forgiven?
Depends on how nice we are.
Yeah, there's a parable about this. But that theme shows up over and over again, but it's always intensely ambivalent. It's a little bit like the beginning of Plato's Republic, where it begins in a sort of opening salvo of Western political philosophy. Starts with this old guy Cephalos saying, oh, justice is just a matter of paying your debts. Socrates blows that one out of the water right away. Says, no, it isn't. That's ridiculous. But then it's okay, not that, then what? And that question, okay, not that, then what, is in a way asked in almost all the great religious works. If you go back to the Brahmanas, the origins of Hindu philosophy, they start with you owe your life as a debt to the gods, you repay it through death, and before that sacrifice. But then they just make it clear that's not true at all. They say, well, you also owe debt to your parents, and you repay that by becoming a parent. You owe a debt to the sages, and you repay that by becoming a sage. So in a way, what you do, you repay the debt by realizing there isn't a debt. You become that which you think you owe to. And, it raises the question, how can you owe something to the cosmos? That would imply me and the cosmos are two partners to a business deal, which is kind of absurd. And it's when you realize that absurdity, you realize there is no debt. In the Bible, they start by framing morality as debt, and then they say, no, it's actually forgiving debt. It's redemption. It's canceling debt. There is a great tradition of debt cancellation in the ancient Middle East that's truly divine. So there's that ambivalence. I might give Buddhist examples as well. Is constant, and it's reflected in this strange dual morality, whereby people do act like that friend of mine I met at the party who was saying, well, you can't ask people to cancel their debts. That's absurd. That idea that debt and morality is the same thing. But also, you look throughout world history, it's almost impossible to find a moneylender who's not represented as evil. So how do you square that? And I think there's a fundamental moral incoherence lying behind the way we talk about these things, which I think is an historical legacy of systems of violence that we no longer are even able to see. It strikes me that the most powerful way ever invented to take a relation of sheer coercion and make it seem moral, any mafioso knows this, or a conqueror, is you say, look, I could kill you, I didn't, you owe me your life, therefore, you owe me, I'll tell you exactly how much you owe me, but I'm a nice guy, I'm going to let you off the hook for the next couple months, but after that, you better show up with the money. Suddenly, the guy who's the victim is the guy running around feeling like a chump all the time, and you just turn the moral relation around. The only real reply you can possibly make to that is, now wait a minute, who owes what to who here? But the moment you say that, you're using the language of debt. And in a way, I think that's what's happening in these religious texts. They kind of have to use that language of debt, because that's the language that's thrown at them by the people running things. But they use it in order to sort of slowly blow it away and say that really morality is something else. And we've been stuck in that situation. We kind of have to use the language of debt. We know there's something wrong with it. Then we slowly kind of move away, but never can completely move away from it ever since.
Paul, if I could, I'd like to
Sure.
give two brief counterexamples to the general principle that debt is considered a bad thing. Alexander Hamilton considered the national debt to be a very good thing. In fact, he encouraged the federal government to take on the Revolutionary War debt of the states. And Hamilton did this with great calculation because he understood that creditors take great interest in the success of whatever individuals or enterprises owe them money. And if the wealthy people of the United States, these were the bondholders, if they became interested, if they were owed money by the federal government, then it would be in their interest to ensure the success of the federal government. So Hamilton was one who believed that a federal debt would be a national blessing. It would ensure the success of the new federal government. In the early 20th century, the U.S. government engaged in what at the time and since was called dollar diplomacy. And the essence of dollar diplomacy was to encourage, especially regimes in Latin America, to transfer the debt that they owed European banks and bankers to American banks and bankers. This would eliminate the temptation of the European governments to secure the debts owed to their bankers and send in gunboats. And it would make sure that the interests of these Latin American countries now look toward New York rather than toward Europe. So debt has been something that has been used for political purposes, at least, well, in American history, since the United States began its business.
One of the things that you might want to incorporate in your answers, as I'm going to open this up to the question and answer period of time, is, first of all, that means it must be a great thing that we owe China $1 trillion+.
I can say a lot about that.
Well, you know, there is the old saying that if you owe the bank $1,000, you got a problem. If you owe the bank $1 million, the bank has a problem.
Yeah. How I start the book.
The corollary of that is, in the brave new future, if the dollar is not the currency of the entire world, what does it exactly mean for our ability to be able to buy your books later on? But that said, let's go to the first questioner.
I don't know if it is for either of you. The question is, the sovereign debt, as the proportion of the sovereign debt in the U.S. raises and raises and raises, what does it do to the future growth, the economic GDP output of U.S.? And do you guys subscribe to Reinhardt and Rogoff theory that, historically debt has been detrimental to the growth of civilizations or empires?
Well, you want to take that or?
I'll give it a start.
Okay. Yeah.
To the extent that the debt is owed to non-Americans, then it becomes an issue of what sort of terms do the foreign creditors insist to roll over the debt. So if China is quite happy to continue to roll over its debt, then it's no problem. If China, for example, decides no, it's going to insist on higher interest rates or take its money elsewhere, then that puts a crimp on the American economy. If interest rates have to rise to attract the money to roll over the debt, then the interest rates that the Fed pays or the Treasury pays filter through the economy, and interest rates on everything else goes up. To the extent that the debt is owed internally, just from one individual American to another, or one generation to another, then in terms of the productivity of the American economy, that part's a wash. And then there's also the issue of, and it takes it outside the realm of economics per se, and that is, are there political ramifications? So, for example, this is not on the subject of debt per se, although it did contribute to America's trade debt. During the 1970s, the Arab oil producers decided that they would embargo shipments of oil to the United States during the 1973 war. That was not an economic decision, that was a political decision. Economically, they might as well sell it to whoever would be willing to pay. So if there should become a political component to decisions regarding America's debt, then that would raise all sorts of very difficult and potentially explosive political consequences.
Yeah. I think that also when you talk about sovereign debt crisis, it's a little disingenuous to compare countries that are in very different political situations. So if you look at the countries that have had real sovereign debt crises, they're almost invariably countries that don't control their own currency. So either someplace like Greece now or someplace like Argentina where it was tied to the dollar. Countries which control their own currency supply or have other things they can do. And a country like America where we can create currency that is still used as the world reserve currency in an entirely different position. So we're never going to be in the same situation as Greece and Argentina. It's just not a fair comparison. We could have other problems, but they take on a very different kind and they're much more long-term.
Hi. There's a lot of talk in Congress right now about passing a balanced budget amendment. If this were successful, what would be the likely economic impact?
If the amendment were passed or if the budget were balanced?
I guess both.
Well, I think if the amendment were passed, it would be like passing an amendment saying we're all going to go to heaven. It would have about as much effect because there would be, if you look at the budget of the state of Texas, nearly every state has a balanced budget requirement, but all sorts of subterfuges are resorted to get around that. And if you think the federal budget is designed according to rather creative accounting principles now, just imagine what it would be if you had to balance it each year. So, in the first place, I would be extremely surprised if such an amendment were passed. But if it were passed, I think it would wreak havoc with any way of understanding the budget, simply because if the budget were actually balanced in the very short term. Now, if there were built into it, the budget has to be balanced after the year 2030, let's say, and if it were passed next year, then you could phase things in. But if it kicked in quite short order, well, it would aggravate our recession dramatically if the budget had to be cut by $1 trillion a year.
Yeah. Just to add, I want to recall the whole debate under Clinton, which I think is very telling, when they actually had a budget surplus. Pretty much everybody across the political spectrum who started looking into what that might really mean over the long term, if they got rid of the debt entirely, realized that this would be a terrible idea. And that goes from the Clinton people to people like Alan Greenspan, who, the Ayn Randian, who, started saying, well, he had to come up with an excuse for why it would be a good idea because he was anti-Keynesian, so he couldn't actually say, well, that would mean if there's no government debt, there's going to be no money supply and banks will have to do it and it's not going to work. He didn't want to say that, so he said, it's going to mean socialism because there's going to be such a surplus that the government's going to have to put that money somewhere. They're going to have to buy something, and they're going to have to, logically, they're going to buy things people want, so they're going to start nationalizing everything, and we're going to end up having a communist economy.
We've got room for more questions.
Here comes somebody.
Can you explain what in the world is wampum?
Oh, yeah, I can. As a matter of fact, do you really want
What was the question?
Wampum. What's wampum? Wampum is made from a certain type of shell, which you get this nice white and purple clam, quahog clams, and it was used as it was used largely as a way of making treaties and arrangements and contracts and peacemaking by Native Americans across the northeast coast. But when settlers showed up, there was a very they really didn't have access to gold and silver. They're using a lot of credit systems, and wampum was actually systematized as a way of trading with Native Americans in the fur trade. It became an actual currency of trade. There's no evidence that Native Americans actually used it to buy and sell things to each other, but it became a trade currency that was then adopted as legal tender in most of the northeastern colonies. In the 17th century, largely, yeah. So they took this, fairly casual means of making political negotiations and turned it into money. It's rather similar to what happened to the famous purchase of Manhattan, which, is one of those classic examples of two people thinking something totally different was going on. The Dutch settlers thought they were buying a piece of land and ripping people off, giving them beads and trinkets. The people on the other side thought that this was a presentation of a gift of rare exotica as a pledge of good faith to establish a political, a political treaty which would involve uses of access to land.
I'll piggyback on that answer
Yeah.
briefly. The fundamental money problem in the American colonies, in fact the states during the first few decades of America's national existence, was a shortage of money.
Yeah.
The British government, the British colonial government, disallowed paper money. The provincial assemblies could not issue paper money. And so people were stuck with gold and silver. But gold and silver are rare, and they were especially rare in the colonies. And so the colonists got used to devising other means of currency. Wampum was one. In Virginia, they would denominate things in terms of how many hogsheads of tobacco. In Tennessee, when Andrew Jackson went out there as a young man in his early 20s, in the 1790s, Tennessee at the time was still part of North Carolina. And he went out there to practice as a lawyer. There wasn't enough money to go around, and so his legal fees were often quoted and paid in acres of land. And so if you wanted a will, that would cost you 80 acres. If you had some litigation, that would be a quarter section or something like that. So these are all sort of markers of value, and they're ways of doing triangular and quadrangular trade. If one person wants to do something for someone else, you could barter just back and forth, but that's a binary thing. Once the economy gets more complex than that, then you have to have something that stands in for value. And gold and silver were considered the best. Paper was disallowed, and so you'd use whatever you could come up with.
I'll lead into my question by going to your book, Trader to His Class, and I'm going to lead up to this question. If you go back to Roosevelt, put the banking regulations and insurance in 1933 to help the farmers who lost tons of money through the banks. These banking regulations were in place for 60 years until, I believe, 1993 is when our illustrious Congress removed the regulations on banking. My question leading up to this is, what's your comments about deregulation or regulation of the banking industry, Alan Greenspan's philosophy of free markets?
In history, it's notoriously difficult to determine cause and effect, but I will just say, going along with what you mentioned, in 1933, Franklin Roosevelt and Congress passed a number of banking regulations in trying to ensure that banks not do again what they had done during the 1920s. Namely, they took depositors' money and they invested it in the stock market. And it seemed like a really good idea as long as shares were going up. Because while they might be able to lend it out at 3% on mortgages, they could make 25% a year on the stock market. And they were paying their depositors 2% and pocketing the rest. And it seemed like a wonderful thing until the stock market crashed in 1929. And then the depositors who had put their money in banks rather than buying shares of stock themselves because of the perceived greater security in banks, found that they had lost their money and they had no recourse. So under the Roosevelt administration, the Democratic New Deal Congress passed regulations to make sure that banks couldn't do that. They couldn't take your deposits and then go play the stock market with them. Those regulations were in place until the 1990s. They were repealed in the late 1990s, and 8 years later we had the financial crisis of 2008. Now, it's impossible to prove beyond the shadow of any doubt that the one led to the other. As I say, this business of causation in history is impossible to prove because you can't rerun the experiment with the different premise. But it certainly does seem suggestive that there was nothing like 1929 during the whole period from 1933 until the regulations were repealed. And then within just a few years after the repeal of the regulations, along comes 2008, which is the worst financial crisis since 1929. So I guess you can make of that what you will.
Yeah, I would add one thing. When we use the word regulation, I think it's really important to remember that regulation has not stopped. It's changed its nature. I mean, so we've got this weird word trap where when they do regulations the banks don't like, that's called regulation. When we do regulation the banks do like, that's not somehow. That's a free market. It's all regulated. I mean, there's an incredibly elaborate legal code, which the banks, of course, play a huge part in writing.
Follow-up to that is, do you think that that they'll ever get around to regulating trading in derivatives?
I don't know the answer to that question, but I did read an article in the Washington Post a couple of days ago saying that President Obama has raised more money from Wall Street and the financial community for his re-election than all of the Republicans combined.
Yeah.
So if the Democratic incumbent has ties that close to Wall Street, I'm not going to hold my breath for tighter regulations in the near future.
Yeah.
Could you comment on the Federal Reserve and its shareholders, and also the current calls to either have it audited or abolished?
You want to take that?
Sure, I'll try
take
it.
Yeah.
The Federal Reserve has been everybody's favorite whipping boy since 1913, when it was created. The Federal Reserve has made its share of missteps. But if you compare America's financial history during the 19th century, up until the creation of the Federal Reserve, and then how things were from 1913 until the present, you would see that the wild roller coaster ride of panic and bubble and panic and bubble. There was a panic of 1819, there was a panic of 1837, there was a panic of 1857, there was a panic of 1873, there was a panic of 1893, there was a panic of 1907. And then the Federal Reserve was created in 1913. Yes, indeed, there was a panic in 1929, and the Fed really got that one wrong. The Fed allowed the money supply to shrink by as much as a third, which had devastating consequences for the economy as a whole. But the Fed learned from that, and the American financial system from then forward has performed a whole lot better than it did before there was a Fed. Now, as to the question, Ron Paul contends that the Federal Reserve is unconstitutional. And if you look at the Constitution in particular, if you look at Section 8 of Article 1, which specifies the enumerated powers of Congress, it says that Congress has the power to coin money. It doesn't say that Congress has the power to print money.
Yeah.
This is where Ron Paul and the libertarians say that the Federal Reserve is unconstitutional. Now, they do have a Supreme Court decision in their favor. In 1870, the Supreme Court ruled, remember those legal tender notes that I said came out of the Civil War? In 1870, the Supreme Court ruled that the legal tender law and the notes were unconstitutional. But before that jolt to America's financial system could work its way through the economy, two of the justices retired. Ulysses Grant appointed two new ones, and they changed their minds. And they said that legal tender was constitutional. So if Ron Paul wants to go back to the 1870 decision, okay, that's his prerogative. But since the the mid-1870s, the Supreme Court has said it's constitutional. So I guess we're going to live with it until we get a President Paul.
Yeah. And actually, as a result of that constitutional clause, coins are still produced by the federal government. It's just dollar bills that aren't.
So say for those of us that are nostalgic for the Supreme Court of 1870. We've got time for two more questions. The woman in the wonderful jacket and the man with a cowboy hat.
Hi. I'm curious to hear your opinion about the phenomenon that our current generation of students is dealing with, the graduation with pretty much what you would call a crushing debt.
Yeah.
And would you call that a debt trap?
Yes.
And if so, what do you think the impact of that is going to be?
Yeah, well, the way I always put it is this: throughout most of human history, the sort of nightmare scenario of total social breakdown that people envisioned was precisely the debt trap. Essentially, that 1 or 2% of the population would end up with all the resources, end up lending it to everybody else, and people would start falling so deeply into debt they'd have to sell members of their family. Their children would be pawned. They'd end up having to work for households of strangers. Eventually, people might even have to sell themselves to work for others into slavery. And there was various mechanisms that were put into place to make sure that didn't happen. Most famous of which is simply debt cancellation. Used to be in Mesopotamia, every new king would just say, okay, clean slate, start over. All debts are canceled. Or commercial debts would often be left aside, but consumer debts wiped out. The Jubilee was another version of the same thing. The point I always make is that, if Aristotle were somehow put in a time machine and magically transported to here, he would probably think that the distinction between selling yourself to work for strangers and renting yourself to work for strangers was kind of a legalistic distinction. He would look at Americans and say, these people are debt slaves. I think the great social crisis that everybody is terrified of for much of human history has happened to us. And we've made up this language where what people used to think of as slavery is now called freedom. But, has this but that's what's happening. And I think an very old-fashioned remedy might be exactly what's called for right now.
Where would you advise people to put their money today? And what do you think of the current Wall Street social protests?
Where to put your money today?
Portfolio manager brands. Let's.
I was going to say, I don't think I'm getting paid enough to offer that kind of advice. What do I make of the Occupy Wall Street protests? I think it's fascinating. I'm a little bit surprised that it took this long, but in fact, if you remember, the original agenda of the so-called Tea Party movement was its complaint against the bailouts of Wall Street. But by maneuvers that I don't entirely comprehend, it was largely taken over by the Republican Party. I think the Republican Party is starting to have second thoughts about this. But the protests of the Occupy Wall Street movement remind me very much of the protests of the 1890s, where at first, when the populists got together, they didn't have much of an agenda, but they had a sense that things had really gone wrong, and that people who worked hard were not being rewarded. People were suffering the consequences of other people's sins and missteps, and that in a country that was premised on the American dream, that dream became harder and harder to realize. And so they simply began to protest at first. They didn't know quite what they wanted to do, except to let people know that they were fed up with this. It's very early to tell, I think, what the Occupy Wall Street movement intends to accomplish, except to get the word out that there are a lot of people that are very unhappy. The populists eventually devised an agenda. They put forward candidates. Some of the candidates won. Their highest profile candidate, William Jennings Bryan, did not win the presidency. But the platform that Bryan ran on was in most ways actually accomplished. The United States did not monetize silver, but it turned out that new discoveries of gold in the next half-decade did increase the American money supply, and prices began to rise again. So I would be surprised if an Occupy Wall Street candidate were nominated and ran for president next year. But I wouldn't be surprised if the various grievances that they're airing became important in the election.
There's just very quickly, because they want us to wrap up, and can I give David just 1 second just to comment on this? Go for it.
Yeah, well, speaking as one of the 80-odd people who actually started up the movement in New York, we're not, if nominated, I shall not run. If elected, I shall not serve. No, we're not intending to do that. But I think all of us would say that, run candidates. But the point, in a way, the book and the movement are meant in the same way. We haven't been talking about the things that were really important. We've allowed political conversation in this country to veer completely away from the concerns that people actually have in their day-to-day life. And I think that's what Occupy Wall Street was about, to just change the nature of the political conversation in this country. And if we can do that, I think that's amazing in and of itself.
Thank you all for coming.
Since this is a tent full of readers, I would recommend that if you want to know more about this topic, I would direct you to not only buy these books, but also take a look at Richard Hofstadter's book, The Age of Reform, the quintessentially important book about this. But weren't these guys great? And one more hand, go buy their book.